Pardon me. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Natalie Newman, and I am a policy associate at the Midwest Energy Efficiency Alliance. Excited to see you all bright and early this morning. We were excited to see that we were the first listed panel. I don't know what that means about us, but you can infer. But we're really excited to talk to you today about urban heat and all of the different resilience and mitigation strategies that are happening in the Midwest, and hopefully do some collaboration and planning for the future of what we can do moving forward together to solve these complex issues. So I'll start with just a little bit of level setting and introduction about urban heat. UHI is Urban Heat Island. If there are ever any words or acronyms that you don't know, feel free to call it out and raise your hand. This can be a really wonky acronym-y kind of alphabet soup space, and we want to make sure that this information is accessible to everyone. So I'll do a little bit of a level setting and talk about the state of the urban heat island in the Midwest. And then I'll pass it over to my colleague, Sarah Mincy, who will talk about her work connecting educational research and all of these great federal funding opportunities. And then we'll pass it to Rachel Shai, yes, connecting research and the human experience, and specifically summer indoor air temperatures and some interventions using air conditioning. And then we'll pass it to Rajiv last, who's going to talk about utility data access and some opportunities for policy advocacy. So you can get excited for that. And then we'll bring it into a panel discussion with some Q&A. So if you have any burning questions, you're welcome to add them to the Whova app right now, and I'll keep an eye on that, or you can write them down and ask them in person. If you're on Zoom, I do ask that you put your questions in the Whova app if possible. I'll try to keep an eye on the chat as well, but just a lot of places to pay attention. But if there are any questions that we don't get to during this session, we can go back and answer those questions in the app afterwards. And as Heather mentioned yesterday, you'll have access to the app several months after the conference, so you'll be able to collect that information. All right, so a quick level set of some of the information we're going to talk about today. An urban heat island, some strategies that are currently being used to mitigate the impacts of it, some measuring and tracking that data collection, particular mitigation strategies. So what are folks doing on the ground right now to deal with the urban heat island effect? And then some opportunities for utilities to get involved. I don't know if we have any utility folks in the room here, but maybe you have utility friends back home that you can bring this information to. This is just a quick overview of my organization, the Midwest Energy Efficiency Alliance. We are a member org focused on energy efficiency. So I won't spend too much time on that, but my main goal for today is to share this awesome white paper that my colleagues wrote on the urban heat island for, I believe it was an ACEEE summer study white paper, but they really did a deep overview of all of the mitigation strategies in the Midwest for urban heat island. So this is linked in the Whova app. I shared it, and it should be associated with this session as well. But urban heat island just generally refers to the fact that it tends to be hotter in urban areas in cities. So you can see this lovely little visual here. The rural areas, or the more rural areas that have more green cover, more open space, less pavement, less buildings, those tend to be cool sinks. And then in the downtown or commercial or urban residential areas, you can see that those heat levels not only get hotter, but they also remain hotter. I'm sure you've experienced this impact, even if you didn't know what it was. If you're in a city at night, it tends to not cool down very much. It can still be really hot. In Chicago, where I live, in the summer, even in the middle of the night when the sun's not out, you can feel the heat coming off of the pavement and the buildings still. Whereas if you're out in the country and you're standing in the middle of a field, at night, it's going to be a lot colder than it was during the daytime, because you no longer have the sun, obviously heating things up, and that material around you, the organic material, is not holding on to the heat in the same way. So besides the basics of urban heat island, I'm sure this is a very informed group about climate change and the impacts that climate change is having on our urban environments in particular. And this troubling heat is something we are seeing more and more of. And so folks are paying attention and starting to do something about it. So with the knowledge that extreme heat is definitely here to stay and will likely continue to become more and more extreme in the near future, focusing on the environmental injustice impact is really critical. So in the summer months, even amongst locations within one city, temperatures in low income areas can be 7 degrees hotter compared to nearby higher income areas. And that's for a lot of different reasons. Some of it is availability of parks and tree cover, and other reasons, but that's a good thing to keep in mind as well, that intersectionality that we talked about yesterday. The urban heat island is impacting everyone, and it's impacting some people more than others. This impact also increases our building energy use. So I'm sure we'll talk a lot about energy use and what we can do to reduce that, but buildings actually use about 40% of the energy use in the United States. So it's a really big impact, increasing that cooling demand for the increase in temperatures. And then peak energy demand, we're talking about reliability and dependency of the grid. So this demand and increased cooling will obviously increase the energy demand on the grid. So there are a lot of different really innovative strategies that folks are implementing. This research digs into a few different examples, being community engagement. So this particular program that I want to mention is in Hunts Point, Longswood. It's their Be a Buddy system for dealing with urban heat island. So in particular, this is a community engagement strategy where you use members of your community that you already have connections with to check in on folks around you during these heat waves. I'm going to quickly go through this. These are some other UHI mitigation strategies that we reference in the paper. So there's green infrastructure that is pretty self-explanatory. Those green spaces, plants, cooling surfaces, solar photovoltaics are actually a cooling surfaces, cool pavements and cool roofs as well. There's something to be done in buildings and development. So building energy codes and ordinances, which you'll hear more about from Rajiv later. Different targeted canopy restoration projects, development codes and procurement policies. And then for the utility side, spending money on energy efficiency programs, doing integrated grid planning, an opportunity for innovative pilots in the space, in the utility space. They're able to do a lot of this testing, and then also educating their customers about the impacts of urban heat and what they need to be careful of. So I'll go through this pretty quickly. I want to make sure we have enough time.
Can you share the screen on
Absolutely.
Zoom? That's something that I just got a text about. We just need to make sure Zoom folks can see this.
Definitely.
Thank you.
Thanks for flagging that, Sarah.
Yeah, I think.
For folks on Zoom, are you now able to see the screen? I don't know if you're able to give any feedback here.
You can ask them to just throw a thumbs
Oh,
up.
I see a thumb from Luz. Thank you, Luz, and apologies for that. We will share these slides afterwards, so you'll get access to all this information. But very much appreciate you calling that out, Sarah. Thank you.
Of course.
So this is just a brief overview of the recommendations that are pulled together in this research. Some of it starts with just collecting the data, making sure you know what is going on, measuring those temperatures in different parts of the city. There are different incentives that can be in place, incentivizing the utilities to do something about this problem that benefits their customers and also can be a benefit to them in terms of cost recovery or just improving their reputation in the community if it's seen that they're doing something about these issues. And then identifying those different policy levers for deployment of these different strategies as well. So this is a really quick overview of some of the body of work in the urban heat island space in the Midwest. I'm excited for you to be able to dig into this paper later on your own because it's really great, but I want to make sure we have time for all of our other panelists as well. So I'll briefly introduce our next speaker, Sarah Mincy, PhD from Indiana University's O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs and the director of the Environmental Resilience Institute at IU as well.
Thanks, everybody. Hi, good morning. I hope you're doing well. Welcome to the summit. I'm going to talk to you about a specific topic to deal with urban heat, urban forests. So this is my area of research in urban forest management and how we can use urban forests as climate solutions. So first, just some level setting. Urban green infrastructure is increasingly being used for community resilience for a variety of reasons, right? And so just so that we're all on the same page, urban green infrastructure is this network of green spaces across communities. These can be inclusive of urban trees, which we call urban forests, and that can look like parks, it can look like street trees, it can look like random trees that pop up in alleys. That's all the urban forests. And they serve to provide ecosystem services to our communities that really offer resilience. So resilience is the concept that when we have a disturbance, we can bounce back from that. We are either going to be able to recover, adapt, or transform because of a resilient system. And trees provide us with a lot of the characteristics of a resilient system. So community resilience is increasingly important because Indiana is facing climate change as our own Midwestern states. But I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the specific issues that Indiana is facing. And it was five or 6 years ago now, there was a collaboration from Indiana University and Purdue and Notre Dame and other universities and our researchers that developed this report called the Indiana Climate Change Impacts Assessment Report, which has been super useful for all of us who work in climate change science and solutions. And this report identified that Indiana is getting warmer. Surprise, surprise. The annual temperature has increased 1.3 degrees Fahrenheit over the last century. And that has meant that we have longer frost-free seasons, fewer cold days, significantly warmer overnight temperatures, which is a really big issue in urban areas because of the urban heat island and the fact that our impervious surfaces and darker surfaces absorb heat, re-radiate that at night, and more heat waves that are longer and hotter. And then the second issue is that Indiana is getting wetter overall, but seasonality matters. And I'm not going to dig into this too much, but basically just so you know, it looks like our winters and springs are going to be a lot wetter. And then the models aren't as clear in terms of the summer and fall, but probably drier. So what do these impacts mean for us in terms of the social and economic side of what we work on? So hotter weather is going to mean more air pollution, more allergies, more heat related illnesses and deaths, greater need for air conditioning and costs associated with air conditioning. There'll be more pests because we won't have the frost and freeze that we need to kill them. There's a huge risk to the power grid. And something I just identified yesterday, I was looking at a legislative committee report from August of 2023. I didn't realize that Indiana actually is tied with Wisconsin for the highest per capita exposure to heat of our workforce. So 1.1 million employees in Indiana face exposure to high heat, and that's 32% of our workforce. Essentially, all of this means we have to do so much more with less, right? This is an issue of resilience. When we have a disturbance like a heat wave that's killing people or sending people to the hospital, we have to put more public resources into dealing with that. That means less public resources for proactive, preventative kinds of things, like building up an urban forest that's actually going to help cool the city. So I want to talk a little bit about those services that urban forests offer to us. The co-benefits that they bring are amazing. With one investment, we get multiple benefits like moderation of climate, reduction in building energy use, and atmospheric carbon dioxide, of course, as the tree grows, improving air quality and water quality, mitigating storm water runoff and flooding is a huge one for cities. And that's sort of all the biophysical side of things, the regulating ecosystem services. But when we move to the cultural ecosystem services, there's research that shows reduction in crime rate, higher property values, more business in areas where we have tree-lined streets. There's a positive effect on physical and mental health for people. People are better able to learn. Students are better able to learn. There's a greater capacity for productivity at work. Of course, we have all the recreational and tourism benefits that come from a beautiful green city. And then some of my own research has shown that we can really bring people together when they help collaborate on urban forest management. So if we get communities to plant trees with us and water trees with us, then we often see networks being built between neighbors. People learn each other's names. They're more likely then to take collective action for other things like crime watch or even social things like having block parties, right? And that builds community resilience in a time of climate change when we're going to need to rely on each other. All of these benefits happen at various scales, of course, and you can see the graphic on the right side that it's at the tree level where we see immediate shade, right? And immediate evapotranspiration benefits for the temperature in particular. But then when we go to the street level, we can cool an entire street, making it a walkable space, which of course is a co-benefit, right? Especially for climate change. And then at the citywide scale, we can really cool and mitigate the urban heat island effect with broader green space. The irony, of course, is that urban forests are actually impacted negatively by increasing temperatures, right? So there's plant heat stress is an issue. And this graphic on the right-hand side shows you some of the increase in the annual number of days with high temperatures, which lead to plant stress. That stress can mean that carbon storage is reduced, that tree mortality might increase because it sort of starts the tree mortality spiral. There's, of course, physical damages when we have large storms, and then this increase in pests and pathogens, which also can affect trees' physiology. So all of this means that, again, going back to the idea of more with less, this means we actually also have to do better planning and more engagement with communities to help with tree management. So how do we then address the fact that there are disadvantaged communities that have fewer ecosystem services because they have less urban forests, and how do we engage them, right? So I want to talk to you about how we are trying to focus some efforts in disadvantaged communities in the work that we're doing here in Indiana, but it starts with everybody having an understanding that climate change impacts do not affect everyone equally. So on the right-hand side here, you see this headline from the Washington Post. The EPA just detailed all the ways climate change will hit US racial minorities the hardest, and it's a long list. And part of the reason is that we have this history of redlining. Probably you're all familiar with this, but this was back in the 30s and 40s. The Homeowners Loan Corporation did not give out mortgage loans fairly. In fact, there were racist practices, and many of the communities of color and immigrants were denied mortgage loans. And that has a legacy effect on the landscape in that we now see that those are spaces where there was no wealth built up, right? And there was little public service and input into those areas. So we have a lot more roads, a lot more brownfields, and a lot less canopy cover in these disadvantaged communities that were traditionally redlined. The graphic on the left shows you a study of lots of different cities across the US. There's Portland, Oregon is highlighted here with the black circles. You can see that the different rankings from the Homeowners Loan Corporation, A is where it's okay to give loans, D is red line, don't give loans, right? Those people are not going to pay you back. This is the racist concept, right? So what do we see today? That the A communities have much cooler temperatures. Those neighborhoods, much cooler temperatures compared to the red line communities where we see much hotter temperatures on average. So urban heat is affected by this legacy of racism on the landscape. And so we have to do extra work in those spaces to help bring ecosystem services to those communities. This is, some research has shown us that we really do have an equity issue in disadvantaged communities. Watkins and Garish, two of my colleagues in 2018, did a meta-analysis of all these other studies that have looked at the association between green space and urban forests and income and race. And what they found at a meta level was that we do see that there is urban forests are inequitably distributed in terms of race and income. Shannon Watkins also did a study with me where we looked at not just the current canopy cover, but where we're planting trees. Are we actually exacerbating this problem? Are we planting in wealthier, wider communities? And the answer is, yeah, generally we are, when we looked at 5 different nonprofits across 5 different major cities in the Eastern US. Now, this is not necessarily intentional. I always want to point that out. It can be very difficult to work in disadvantaged communities for a variety of reasons. So knowing we have this issue, this is part of the reason there's a huge federal investment right now from the IRA running through the Forest Service, $1.5 billion for urban forestry work in disadvantaged communities specifically. And so we're taking advantage of that at ERI where I am, and we have received a grant in that from that program. Do we just dive in and start planting trees in disadvantaged communities? No, there's a huge body of research and lots of practitioners who've had very terrible experiences trying to go in and plant trees in communities that have been otherwise disenfranchised by government or other public entities or figures of authority, right? So there's a study in Detroit about these communities that didn't want to receive trees from a nonprofit up there. And some of the reason was that they lacked trust in the city government, and by extension, the nonprofit that was trying to plant trees. There was a lack of engagement by the nonprofit in asking the community whether they wanted trees, what did they need? Maybe they didn't care about trees as much as they cared about lighting or sidewalks, right? And they didn't ask those kinds of questions. And generally, these communities just felt a lack of control of their environments. And there's a long heritage narrative and history about why this is the case. Nonetheless, in every community that you're going to go work in to plant trees, you absolutely have to work with the community members to understand that heritage narrative and how they will or will not receive trees and not force them upon those folks, right? So community engagement is really a part of an environmental justice process and approach when we look at urban forestry. So at ERI, we asked ourselves, what can we do? The Environmental Resilience Institute works across Indiana, co-producing climate resilience with communities through something we call the resilience cohorts. We bring cities and towns together and run them through a process maybe to do a climate action plan. So we've had this history of leveraging our students as what we call McKinney Climate Fellows to do this work, which is really a great way to get that work done. And in 2022, we piloted something called the Urban Green Infrastructure Resilience Cohort, where we got funding from the state. We went and did canopy cover assessments of cities and then developed tree planting plans in communities, in the neighborhoods where trees were needed. We leveraged that pilot and applied for IRA funding and got $5 million to continue this program for the next 5 years in the state of Indiana, working with cities and towns. So I'm going to show you a few details about our grant. Basically, we are working only in these disadvantaged communities. These are going to be annual cohorts of about 5 cities that we'll work with, and we're going to produce with them a canopy cover assessment, so data that we will use to delineate priority planting areas in disadvantaged communities. We'll develop we have an online platform where we'll put their urban forestry data in perpetuity. We'll develop with the community a tree planting and maintenance plan based on all of that data. And then we hope to build out their urban forestry workforce by engaging the community and local contractors who will be planting trees with us and watering trees with us. And then the exciting part is we actually plant the trees. So we're going to plant on average about 100 trees in each of the communities we work with, so that by the end of the program, we're going to have 2,000 well-planted trees across the state of Indiana in disadvantaged communities. So this is the annual timeline. I don't think I need to go through that in much detail, but a really important point here that actually is covered up, sorry, is $140,000 worth of value to any individual city that works with us to help plant their disadvantaged communities. This is the timeline of the 5-year timeline of the program, so that you can see that over the course of 5 years, we'll accomplish 4 different cohorts, 5 cities in each cohort. So we'll get up to 20 cities here and over 2,000 trees planted. The key partners in this program, that's my staff at the Environmental Resilience Institute, and Stephanie Freeman Day is here in the room. Stephanie, you could raise your hand. She's the coordinator for this program. She's going to be working with our great students at IU as McKinney Climate Fellows who go and live in the community for the entire summer to do the work that we're going to do. We're working with consultants, Davie Resource Group, and others We're working with researchers, so faculty members who are going to do research around this intervention, right? Pre and post analysis of the communities, both in terms of urban heat, but also some social and health factors. And then our community partners are critical. So these are the city foresters, urban foresters, or other staff in the city that manage the trees. And then obviously the disadvantaged community, the neighbors, the community members that are working there are the people we're going to be talking to. So this is a map of our cities that we're going to be working with across the state in the first cohort. So I'm excited to show you this. And at this point, I want to say one of the collaborations that I'm looking for is additional folks who are interested in doing research. So you can see that we clearly have a timeline for each cohort. It would be really easy if anybody is a researcher in here who wants to think about what kind of effects do tree plantings have on the community, biophysically, socially, economically. I would love to work with you and talk to you about how you might be able to coordinate with us. So there's my contact information and Stephanie's contact information. And I think I'll stop now and pass back to you. Okay, thanks.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Rachel Shy, and I work at Elevate. We are a mission-based nonprofit based in Chicago. We work nationally. Our mission is that we believe that everyone deserves to have access to clean and affordable energy and water in their homes and communities, no matter where they live. And today I'm going to talk to you about an indoor air temperature and heat adaptation study that we did last summer. And kind of putting this into context, we talked a little bit about urban heat island, and we've talked about tree canopy. Well, what's happening at the building level, right? And our next speaker is also going to be talking about building level impacts. And we know that there's much more research that's being done on urban heat islands and less studied about what are the impacts in the building. So I just want to note that you guys all know this, that it's getting hotter. It's not just it feels hotter, it really is. And that they're becoming more frequent and prolonged. And last summer during this study, we hit the record that was only with 120 degrees, the heat index, so both the temperature and the humidity. And as we're getting wetter in the Midwest, the feels like temperature that is getting hotter, as well as just the temperature. We hit those maximums for the first time ever. And in the US, it was also across the world, it was the hottest summer on record. So we did capture some data during this time. So we know that there's a lot of variation at the household level. So that the urban heat island, when they're looking at communities or city levels, there's a lot of variation at the household scale as well. Two houses on the same block may be experiencing heat differently. That's part of the architecture, the construction, the orientation. What kind of tree canopy do you have on your yard? What are the materials your house is built with? And what does that ventilation look like? Do you have AC? Do you not have AC? And so I think this is really key to that, you know, even if you're in the same community, whether it's a quote disadvantaged community or affluent, you can have a completely different experience than your neighbor. And so and temperatures can be exacerbated indoors, that it's not just the outdoor temperature, but can actually get worse indoors. And we talked a little bit about like the heat being absorbed by particularly masonry buildings that then gets released later on in the day and at night. So, so what is going on in our buildings is super important. So I want to give a shout out to my colleagues who worked on this study with us. This was a collaboration between Elevate and Illinois Tech, formerly known as IIT. And it was funded by the Diffusing Disasters Working Group at Northwestern through the Buffett Institute of Global Affairs, along with Chicago Department of Public Health and Chicago Department of the Environment, formerly named was the Office of Climate and Environmental Equity. And this was part of a series of projects done by Diffusing Disasters that are ongoing, including the Heat Watch initiative, which was a NOAA initiative that was also done in several cities. And Natalie mentioned, some of that urban heat island mapping with the NOAA work. We did this in Chicago in July, and those results are up on the Coolshy website. So in terms of what we did is we're measuring indoor air temperature differentials in 10 homes, and we surveyed homeowners on their adaptive capacity and passive cooling strategies. Now, we were looking at their concerns with respect to extreme heat, their risk perception, their strategies and behavior, both at an individual and a household level, and then also what they were interested or their attitudes towards cooling and mechanical cooling. And as I said, Diffusing Disasters is developing a heat vulnerability index. So we'll have something at the personal level. We've got our work at the building level, and then the Kappa Strategies work at the neighborhood level. So all of it is meant to help reduce risk in populations. So what we did is we recruited 10 homeowners in the representative home types. Full disclosure, I was one of those homeowners. I'm home number 4. And we put 4 sensors in those homes, and these are homes without central air. And so we measured that over July and August and early into September. And we did we did measure many metrics, but what we're reporting on is both temperature and heat index. So what you're seeing on the right is that heat index, that's the feels like temperature when the temperature and the humidity then meet. So I'll reference this kind of chart later on. So these are the homes in the study, and they're the archetypical homes in the city of Chicago. So I'm going to give you a results summary right off the bat because I want to just let you know all 10 homes reached either the extreme caution or danger threshold on August 24th. We had a really mild, moderate summer overall. And most of those spaces exceeded those temperatures, anywhere from like 1 to 34% of the time, even in a moderate summer. So not even the heat wave days. Most people stayed home during the heat waves, and they employed multiple strategies to keep cool. They were throwing 15 out of 16 strategies, and I'll talk a little bit about that. They're throwing the kitchen sink at it. They're trying everything they can. And I think a key one is only 50% thought their homes were too hot, and they didn't have concerns from themselves, but they had concerns from neighbors. So I think that this is kind of a salient point. So what I'm showing here is each of the 10 homes. The blue ones are frame homes, the brown ones are masonry homes. And the 80-degree threshold is National Weather Service for kind of the caution level. And then above that is how many hours during the August 24th heat wave were above that threshold. So you see a lot of 24 hours that the above range from in the different spaces. So on the bottom is first and second floor, and then you see on home 4 there was a basement. So basically only the basement stayed cool for 10 hours of the day. And that maximum differential was about 16 degrees from the floor 0 to the second floor. So we look at heat index, that level of 103 degrees is similar all you see in the orange and in the red, all 10 homes reach that level. And even the minimum heat index stay was an extreme caution. And all those homes at the coolest part of the day. So we did do the survey questions. Like I said, we talked about concerns with respect to extreme heat, risk perception, what are their strategies and behavior, and cooling. So here's some quotes from it. When I said that people were throwing the kitchen sink at it, the individual and the household strategies, there were 16 of those, and the only one that had less than 50% was leaving the house. And cooling the home, a lot of people didn't want to use air conditioning. They put it in or turned it on just during the hottest periods. And when they did, it was about 16 hours that day that they were using. And when I said about 80% were moderately concerned about facing heat waves, and the top line is they were more concerned about their friends and family and their neighbors than they were about themselves. And I like this quote, that they're mostly concerned with others who are sensitive to heat. And, I got used to it. I can tough it out. And we do have one room with an AC that we can retreat to. And I bolded the word retreat. I think that's a really powerful word, because what is retreat? It's fleeing, right? And people are fleeing to like one room. I know my teenager was not happy that I was sharing the room with her, sleeping in the one air conditioned room. But we were also like, we ate her food up there that one night. And when you're working in the same space and everyone's working, it's just no one's sleeping well. I think that's a key point about keeping. So again, here are the results summary. And then study insights. So there are 4 kind of themes or of recommendations. The first one is access to safe conditions and affordable cooling. We know that even people who have access to AC sometimes don't use it because of affordability issues. And Sarah was mentioning all of the IRA funding that's coming through. A lot of the decarbonization, electrification funding is for energy efficiency and heat pumps. This is a key opportunity for the US to provide cooling, heat pumps, and provide cooling and efficient heating and cooling for people who don't have it. So very much a prioritization of air sealing and insulation to keep that cooling in, and then getting air conditioning first. And maybe it's not just without central cooling, but maybe it's also people who live alone or are seniors. You can really kind of prioritize those investments. The second bucket is the need for additional risk assessment. And Sarah, you were also talked about kind of this engagement and the local community, and really understanding what are their needs and opportunities, and engaging and understanding both education, but also what are those assets, what are those community assets, and what kind of resiliency initiatives and could be deployed in those neighborhoods. The third one is improved education and communications, both before and during heat events. And this is again, like a lot of it's part of it is, how are you getting your information? How do you know you're at risk? What are the National Weather Service channels for municipalities? But at a local level, how are you getting your information? How are you checking in on your neighbors? And so I'm there. Thank you.
This is the final presentation, I promise, guys. And then we'll get to the fun part, talking with you guys. So my name is Rajiv Ravlapati. I'm the Associate Director of Government Engagement for another national nonprofit called IMT. And I'm glad I'm ending on this topic because I think what I'm going to be talking about is utility data, specifically the access to utility data and how it's underpinning a lot of the commentary and presentations that three presenters before me had talked about, and its relation into the theme that Rachel was talking, or both Rachel and Sarah were talking about building community resilience. So before getting to that, I always like to just tell folks who I am, who's this person in front of you, before I get into the actual nitty gritty of the content. So again, I work for IMT. I'll get into my nonprofit in a second, but I've been Midwest based my whole life. I'm born and bred from Chicago, though I live in St. Louis now. I'm very proud of that fact. Before I've gotten more into my technical role, it started really at an organizing perspective, and all of my work has been done primarily in two states, Illinois and Missouri, which are two very fundamentally different states when it comes to governance, especially when it comes to the governance of our utility programs, at a regulatory level, at a state energy office level, and just from a politics level too. One state is definitely better than the other. I bet you can take a guess when that is. And my work has been rooted in utility advocacy, consumer advocacy. I've worked on a number of statewide campaigns, and I've really dug into the niche of utilities work and buildings. And that's what I really get my joy out of for doing the work that I do on a day-to-day basis. And all of that work is still really rooted from my foundational levels of how is the work that I do to date, how will it be incorporated into building power for these communities so they can have the decision-making authority and to be involved and have their not just heard. It's not enough to be heard, but for them to actually have the authority on like figuring out how these IRA dollars will be distributed and allocated, and how the folks who are doing these kind of building retrofit work or helping keep homes cooler, how they can take advantage of it. Ooh. There we go. So I mentioned I'm with IMT. IMT stands for the Institute of Market Transformation. It sounds very think tanky, but we're not a think tank. We're another mission-based national nonprofit based in DC, but our staff is entirely remote. We've got folks working all the way from Boston all the way to Fairbanks, Alaska. And there's actually most of us actually are based in the Midwest. And how we work is, we're very focused on buildings. We work on building decarbonization. Most of the work that we do is policy focused, but we work to transform buildings through a number of ways. Again, mostly through policy, but it's intersections with community engagement, with the utilities and the grid, because utilities have a huge role and impact on all of our daily lives. And there's a certain amount of power that they're able to exert over our daily lives. And we should have more, our community should have more decision-making authority in how these utilities are planning for the future and planning for how we take advantage of things like utility incentive programs. And then we also interact with businesses and building owners and real estate groups so they can work towards our ultimate goal, which is high performance buildings. And high performance buildings means residential, our homes, commercial buildings, class A, B, and C, and industrial buildings. But we don't work on industrial focus. We mostly focus on commercial and some residential work. So the reason I'm here today is because I mentioned that IMT does a lot of work in the public policy space. One of the things that we do is work and create model laws. And the model law that I'm here to talk to you about today is this Model Utility Data Access Law, which was developed in collaboration between IMT, RAP of the Regulatory Systems Project, and also technical input from the EPA, specifically their Energy Star program folks. So this was a law that was developed in response to requests from building owners. There's a whole suite of what's called building performance laws, like benchmarking and transparency laws, which are simply tracking and reporting your annual energy usage to your city. There's over 35 places around the country that have these kind of laws on the books. Indianapolis is one of them. They have a benchmarking law on the books. And then there's like a second category of, okay, you've got these building owners tracking and reporting their energy usage, but now we want to actually get them, to look at using that data to actually invest in their buildings and be more efficient and get towards the goal that we're hoping we all meet is full electrification of our homes and of our buildings. So you can do things then on the next step of requiring building owners to go through audits or tune-ups. So mandating them to do these energy improvements. And then there's this third and final category for building performance laws, which are building performance standards, which is, think of it a bit like equivalent to like MPGs on cars. All cars have to meet certain fuel efficiency standards. Buildings now, you can think of this as meeting specific legal requirements of meeting minimum energy performance thresholds within their buildings. And there's different metrics that you can use. But the reason that's related to this law is because having access to that data is foundational and a precursor needed for all those type of laws. So it's something that we've heard from building owners, from policymakers, from tenant advocates, and many others. So we've written this for adoption. It says written for states, but also specifically for local governments that have municipally owned utilities. I think there are some folks from Columbia, Missouri that registered or might be in the room today. Columbia, Missouri is an example where there's a muni-owned utility. So we published this model law in the fall of last year. It's a living document. Now what we're trying to do with it is work with states to actually adopt this kind of law. Because there are a number of states that have these on the books, but there's also, I'll show a map later on where it's kind of a patchwork network on where these utilities are already providing this kind of data. So in the context of today's theme, talking about urban heat island effect, why do buildings matter and what's the connection to that? Natalie talked about across the country, buildings account for 40% of our greenhouse gas emissions. But when it comes to the electric consumption, I mean, it's almost a third of that. Buildings account for almost a third of that. And there's a lot of waste associated with that. Excuse me. So in order to reach our climate commitments at a national level, at a regional level, state, city level, the pace of building improvement has to dramatically increase. And if you're not understanding how your building is performing or using that data, then how can you be able to make targeted investments in our homes and our buildings across the country? With the urban heat island effect, I think with the research shown, there's a clear demand. Cooling demand is going to continue to rise. And so how can we leverage that aggregate whole building data to make targeted investments in our homes and our properties around the country? And there's, like, while I talk about it in the specific way of like, we need to get these laws on the books, or these kind of ordinances or laws on the books, they have a wide reach of ramifications and how they could be leveraged for more than just building improvements. But there's a challenge. Anyone who's ever worked with utilities know that it's a pretty substantial feat working with utilities and also trying to get this data. In most cases, utilities are not going to do anything unless they're regulated to do something. And so there are a number of challenges when trying to get these kind of laws on the books. There's utilities that offer this data already through a voluntary basis. But, number two there, I'm going a little out of order, but number two, the utilities, I mean, they are challenges and barriers in and of themselves. There are some legitimate reasons. We think of utilities, these are corporations that rake in billions of dollars a year, and they have an arsenal of resources and money to invest. But oftentimes when you're talking to, I live in St. Louis, my primary electric utility is Ameren, Missouri. If I want to obtain my electric data as a building owner, I go to their business assistance center. That infrastructure for managing that data is not the most robust. So there is a lot of data quality issues that utilities have. So a law like this kind of kick them in the butt to move faster and be able to invest those dollars that we're paying into to really have a more proper infrastructure to provide this full building data. There's regulatory hurdles. In every state has some kind of governing regulator that are usually called public utility commissions or public service commissions. That's what it's called in Missouri. The laws and regulations on the book right now don't account for these kind of things, nor are these regulators, specifically like in my example, Missouri, don't understand or don't see the opportunity in front of them of how this utility data is foundational to the kind of laws we're trying to pass in terms of building performance, as well as foundational data that's going to be required for these federal investments and opportunities through the IRA, like the HOMES program or the HERO program, because those programs, which will be administered by state energy offices, they are going to require utility data. It's required in those FOAs and those funding opportunities, and it's required as well in like the administration of these programs to confirm those energy savings. So in places where these kind of laws are already on the books, it's going to be a little bit tougher on trying to confirm those savings and for those state energy offices to be able to administer those programs at an equitable scale. And then there's also privacy concerns, because how we all consume data, like at a unit level, at a building level, it is private information. Utilities and regulators usually are very wary with providing that data. So that is another concern. But the model law works to anonymize and aggregate that data for the whole building. You can get it, you can disaggregate it by tenant, but the purpose of the law is to privatize and anonymize that data so building owners and homeowners can take advantage of it. And then there's also technical limitations, like I mentioned earlier, about both at the administrative level from these regulators actually having the ability to enforce these kind of laws and having the knowledge capacity, as well as the utilities having the infrastructure to provide this data in a seamless way. So this is a map that's offered through the Energy Star program at EPA. If you're ever curious to see which utilities are providing this kind of whole building aggregate data, there's a map for that. Currently, there's over 70 utilities around the country providing this data. In 2023, about 70,000 commercial and multifamily buildings were able to obtain whole building aggregate data. And if you focus to the region that we're in, Midwest, you can see it's still very limited, specifically in the Midwest and in the South. So like in Missouri, it's Ameren that's providing whole building aggregate data. In Northern Illinois, it's ComEd. On the eastern side of Michigan, it's DTE Energy providing that data. In Minnesota, it's Excel Energy, but it's very much patchworky. And when you look at our region, Illinois, Michigan, and Minnesota, those tend to be those champions of energy efficiency typically, and it's great, but you can still see even within those states that data is not available. And how I mentioned Illinois and Missouri are very different states. When it comes to the regulation of our IOUs, investor-owned utilities, it differs there too. Ameren Corporation operates both in Missouri and Illinois, but you can see here on this map, Ameren Illinois is not providing this data right now, even on a voluntary basis, but Ameren Missouri is currently providing this data. So what? Like, why do you care about this? Why should you care about this? For a number of reasons, and I've kind of synthesized this in like 5 bullet points. But Sarah and Rachel started talking about IRA. I mean, for one, for those of us who maybe work with smaller properties, like 2 to 4 unit buildings, like last summer, the city of Chicago, the Department of Housing put out an RFP for helping them guide building a roadmap for how do we decarbonize our residential building stock. In Chicago, 2 to 4 unit buildings, those make up almost 92% of Chicago's building stock. So for building owners and landlords who have trouble accessing this data and then trying to go after these funds, I mean, if there isn't utility data access laws on the books already, or if there's not an easy way to get that, building owners are on the hook for missing out on billions of dollars available through the IRA and through the bipartisan infrastructure law. So it's really important that this data exists so they can use it to go after that funding and actually implement it. This data allows for better targeting of energy improvements and measures. I shouldn't say old phrase, but there's a phrase, you can't manage what you don't measure. For those of us who've done benchmarking for a long time or worked in building performance, it's kind of a mantra that's been built in. But this utility data is, it's in the interest of a utility to being able to understand how this consumption data is being done at a building level. And they can use that to be able to target specific zip codes to push their incentive programs, especially for those low income and disadvantaged communities, which unfortunately, the outreach to those communities and those buildings are not often robust. So every year or every cycle when utility programs come through by your various utility, there's always specific programs for low income and multifamily affordable housing, but those often are not are leveraged enough in those specific communities for those buildings. And those tenants and residents can benefit from those kind of programs and lower utility bills. I think right now we live in an era of rising costs. This cuts into a cross-cutting theme of affordability. So if we can't take advantage of this data to make those targeted investments and keep the cost of affordable housing down, then the affordability crisis is just going to continue to be exacerbated. And we know that there's an affordable housing crisis right now. And this kind of data is very foundational to try and address those issues. For utilities, they can use this for better understanding their customers and planning ahead as the grid is trying to become more and more resilient as we deal with more and more climate disasters. Where I live in Missouri, the biggest two climate threats are increased flooding and more heat. It's very wet in Missouri, it's very humid. Last summer, it felt like, similar to Chicago, like we had that, it felt like 120 degrees, but we also have that added humidity and you just don't want to be outside. And then also, a lot of these things can unlock clean energy jobs and services, but what I mean specifically here is, so for that homes program, where state energy offices will most likely often hire third-party administrators to run those programs and then explain those services for homeowners. Working with insulation contractors or energy auditors, if you can have that data readily available, that will be very useful for them. And so they can make more targeted investments and approaches to those energy conservation measures. So this kind of data also opens up a wider range of analytics jobs, increasing our workforce for those auditors, for those contractors. So it's a really huge ripple effect of what a very wonky, nitty-gritty topic of utility data is, but has wide ramifications for those themes that I'm kind of touching on. And so now, I've kind of talked about the need, who I am, why did we create this model utility data access law? The problem it's trying to address. We know the challenges with it. So what do we do now? Connecting that data to actual policy advocacy. So again, we're working with a couple of states right now to get these laws on their books. But there's, like I said, there's already states on there that have these laws on the books. But now in terms of connecting this data to policy advocacy, it goes beyond just having a state adopt these kind of laws, provide whole building aggregate data. You can use it for other purposes, kind of like what Rachel and Sarah have talked about. So some of these are a little bit duplicative of what they've talked about, specific to leveraging IRA and for engagement. But I think one thing that I do want to touch upon is with this data, you have concrete evidence. I think as Sarah's a researcher, so that hard data is very good to have, but we also live in a world where data is easily manipulated in terms of its messaging and the politicization of it. So having that hard data is great, but it's a matter of how you explain it in terms of affordability, in terms of resilience, in order to get it more salient to advocates who may not understand this topic, but understand its connections to affordability and resilience and to fighting the things that they're doing. So it's really important for those, especially those of us who operate in coalitions and want to have these benefits of the IRA and BIL and utility data flow to environmental justice community. Because that's the other part of IRA too. There's a whole Justice 40 lens in making sure that these investments, yes, we want them to go to tenants, we want them to go to building owners, but we want to make sure we're going first targeting those disadvantaged communities. And 40% of those benefits are supposed to go to those kind of communities, those DACs, those disadvantaged communities, which the IRA calls out. So there's a lot of opportunity to use this data for more than just what I presented here on just how can you use this in advocating for the current policies that you're working towards, whether it's building performance or whether it's trying to create rental registries or tenant protection laws in various cities, which is also a thing that has been growing. In my city of St. Louis, there's a proposed bill for creating a temperature performance standard in rental dwellings. There is a rental registry ordinance that's being proposed right now. So there is this wave that we're in, and it's very fundamental and very foundational that utilities have to work with us on all of these topics, and it's very paramount. So that covers the end of my presentation. So I think we're going to move on now. I'll hand it back to you, Natalie, and I think we're going to get into kind of Q&A. Thank you.
There are a couple of questions Hoover app. I don't know if
Yes.
you saw her.
Yeah. So you can keep your questions coming into the Hoover app. I'm gonna check the Zoom chat real quick and make sure we missing anything from those folks. Thank you so much for the great presentations. We're gonna pivot into a little bit of a panel discussion, but before I do that, I want to get a temperature check on the room for some of the things we were talking about. So we are curious how many people in the room or on Zoom, if you want to raise your hand, we can see your little hands there. How many people have central AC in their residence right now? How many people have window unit AC?
Too.
Yeah, you can answer to more than one. How many people do not have access to air conditioning in their residence? So this is a more of a privileged group. We're seeing that among the room. Let's see, how many people have a significant tree canopy in their neighborhood or in their community? Yeah, it's kind of a tricky one. Yeah, seeing some hands raised on Zoom as well. Thank you for participating. And then how many people know about their state or city's building performance ordinances and standards? Awesome. How many people know about them that don't work on those? Probably no hands. So that's a great level set of where we are in the room. Appreciate your participation here. Yeah, it's good to connect this research and information to the actual experiences that we are having and really think critically about what is going on in your neighborhood and the neighborhoods around you and what is happening in the neighborhoods that you are not seeing day to day. So let me check the Zoom real quick for. I'm gonna move the projector. Let's see. This is mostly for the Zoom folks, just so you can see the video of the panel. Wonderful. For bearing with me. Awesome. But I guess to start, I am going to come over there, but I wanted to give everyone an opportunity to specifically ask if there are specific connections or collaboration that you are looking to make in the room here or during the summit in general. And Sarah, you mentioned yours right off the bat, but
Sure,
go ahead.
we need to use the mic.
Yeah. and you should
People,
be able
I
to
don't
turn
know
it off.
if they can hear us otherwise. Yay.
Okay, great.
Yes, we can hear you.
Well, yeah, so it's what I mentioned before at the end of my talk, which is that I would like to work in researching what the intervention of sequencing might do. And that would, of course, potentially be useful for us for program assessment, reporting back to the Forest Service. But also to have some papers published potentially out of this that might help us continue to leverage urban forests as solutions for urban heat.
Yeah, this is my first time at this conference, and it's really great to see so many fellow researchers and representatives from government and university. And I would say in terms of the collaboration, that's exactly how we like to work, as we have so much access to people and buildings, and we believe in mentioned the roadmap for the city of Chicago, and that was done in collaboration. Elevate did that in collaboration with the National Renewable Energy Lab, and those collaborations are really important because when you work with a university or national lab, then in using their tools, that could then be replicated. So the local community partnerships, local universities, and nonprofit groups working together with government are a really key important collaboration.
I think for me, like one, I mentioned that we're trying to use this model law and now engage with elected officials on trying to get people on the book, but before even doing that, we're more interested on one, understanding the needs of advocates in states that need a better understanding of this topic to effectively engage, and like how we can work in collaboration with them to arm them with kind of we wrote the law, we've got a lot of technical expertise, but when it comes to prioritizing the advocacy, you can give us better framing on how to engage with specific states. And it also depends on the regulators you're talking about too, because I think one thing I didn't cover is how we choose utility commissioners that regulate these utilities varies. Like I live in Missouri, our governor appoints those commissioners. But if you live in Louisiana, utility commissioners are actually elected, an elected position. So, when you're evaluating your gubernatorial governors, governor choices, this fall, it's just another thing. It's just more things for you to wait on, like the potential governor that you choose appoints these commissioners who have a huge impact on how energy is regulated and how we interact with utilities. It's another thing you may roll your eye at, like another thing I got to use to evaluate this candidate, but like that is something that doesn't get discussed a lot about, because utilities is just kind of thought about in the background. When you open up your bill, most people just look at what do I gotta pay this month. But as we can see, in Chicago, I don't live in Chicago anymore, but I do remember my utility bills. And now, People's Gas, the main gas provider, even before your consumption charges are totaled up, just like the fees and administrative stuff, starts at $50 now for a People's Gas utility customer. So, that's the kind of collaboration we're looking for. It's like getting a better understanding of like what you as advocates need to understand why this utility data access is so paramount to all the things that my colleagues up here are working on.
Thank you. It's really helpful. Everybody has the homework assignment to go look up what your utility regulation process is in your state, and figure out how those folks are selected. Great. We do have some questions coming to the app. I appreciate that. So this is a general question. We've talked a lot about engaging with environmental justice or disadvantaged communities, which is something that is pretty easy to talk about and pretty hard to actually do effectively. To Sarah, there is a question. In your experience, do funders know that it takes time to build trust in disadvantaged communities? This person is saying that so many times funders want quantitative results right away. Maybe that's not what they should be focusing on, like number of trees planted.
Yeah, it's definitely shifted recently, and because of the IRA and the Justice 40 focus. And so what I have observed is state of Indiana, I've been here working in urban forestry for a couple of decades now. In our state funding that came from the Department of Natural Resources, Indiana Urban Forestry Division, they had grant funding every year for urban forestry that was totally focused on those quantitative metrics of how many trees did you plant, right? It was all about tree planting. Money had to go to purchase the trees and care for the trees. And that only shifted because of the IRA funding that has now come through the Forest Service down to states. They have, at least in Indiana, the way we're doing it is last year and then this year, new grant program opened up that would pass through much larger grants. These used to be 25. Now we're talking about 250,000 caps on these for cities and towns to propose work in urban forestry that must be in disadvantaged communities. And my experience, my personal experience, is that two different grants that have been funded through this IRA funding, one through the pass through to the state and one directly from the Forest Service, both of those had significant community engagement and significant funds going towards community In fact, the one that's a pass-through from the state, I was so pleasantly surprised. Again, this is where we just used to give money to plant trees. That's all. Is it doesn't even have funds for trees. The nonprofit that I worked with, they were just partnering with the city. They were going to get money from the city for the trees themselves. The money from the state, from the IRA, is solely for community engagement, and it's for tree care, post-planting care, to make sure that those trees survive, which is super exciting. And then the direct federal money that we got, a huge chunk of that is going to pay for community engagement specialist who focuses on equity and justice issues. We're going to make sure that our fellows are truly engaged with the community by putting them into the city and county. They will live there. We are trying to bring in fellows who actually are from disadvantaged communities themselves so that they have a better rapport with these people that understand the community issues. So I think that at least the IRA funding tells us that there's a new focus on true community engagement. And I can't say that's true for a lot of other funding opportunities, but I think that because this is a primary source for urban forestry work and urban community work, it will generally.
So just as a follow-up, Rachel, have any comments on community engagement? Both worked in that space previously, but for folks who are wondering how to begin in the way, these are some guiding questions that you'd like to start with as you're considering doing community engagement for some of this work.
It's worked for a long time. I'm sorry. I certainly don't have like a silver bullet answer on this, because community engagement is, sometimes I think it's a loaded term. I think we want to move away from, I believe, like, I'm referencing Chicago a lot, but like Chicago is doing some innovative things. Like, for example, there's a spectrum. There's like, I don't know how many of you, let me back up. One of these grants offered through BIL and IRAs, one called Recce, and there's a project that IMT is leading on in 9 locations, and actually we're working with Elevate and Mia on that grant. And there's this tool that we are using called the Spectrum of Community Engagement to Ownership. It was created by Facilitating Power. Have any of you ever heard of this tool? Really limited. Okay. And that's not to shame you, because like before I had joined IMT, I mean, I've done community organizing for a long time, but I had never heard of this tool. It's a way of giving a baseline assessment of a city or specific agency on how they have historically done community engagement work on a variety of issues. So from a sliding scale from 0 to 5, all the way from, I think, just starting community informed to actually community ownership. The reason I'm bringing Chicago is because Chicago is their Office of Racial Equity something. It's creating the steering committee for what would co-governance for the community look like for the city of Chicago. I think you'll see more of that, because there's also federal dollars available to do that kind of work. There's just last Monday, I bet for those city workers who are here, that was last Monday was the deadline for, or no, earlier this Monday, the deadline for CPRG pollution reduction grants. Huge pot of money, one-time shot. There's another one-time shot of community change grants, which are on a sliding scale. One of the things that's available in like track 1 of that grant is putting forward in what EPA is calling environmental advisory boards, or you can think of them in terms of like what we like to talk about at IMT in relation to building performance laws. These are accountability boards that would the aim is to give legal authority and decision-making power to these kind of boards to do kind of a governance strategy. So I think we're really interested through our project on using that tool to, one, encourage and foster long-term partnerships with community groups and the cities. That's like the foundational level of the grant that we're working on in 9 locations: St. Louis, Chicago, Indianapolis, and KC. Those are 4 Midwest-based locations we're we're working on. So I don't have like a go-to answer, but I think like moving towards more of a co-governance model is very intriguing, and I think we should do that. It just always, for those of us who've done implementation work, it's like, all right, what does the implementation of a co-governance model actually look like? Because at the same time, we don't want to continue to overburden or tax community members on serving on these kind of commissions or boards. If there isn't going to be any actual authority or enforceability on the recommendations. So it's a way to think about with that spectrum tool, moving away from having boards and commissions that are just advisory to boards that actually have decision-making authority and have the legal enforceability. This is something that often scares city attorneys. City attorneys are always thinking about just shielding their cities from liability. It's uncomfortable, but that's the point of this work.
Thank you. I definitely agree with both of my co-panelists. Certainly, looking at community-led initiatives is the way that we like to approach it. It's not just engagement, it's what do you want in your community and how do we help facilitate that? So having the flexibility and creating the flexibility, and then also the funding to go directly to the nonprofits in those communities, that they're getting paid to do the work, and maybe we're an implementation partner, but they're actually leading that work. So and having that flexibility. So for example, when doing energy retrofits in a building, we've got this program, right? And do you qualify or do not qualify? But you know what? Maybe they need some health and safety work done. They need a broken window fixed or it's going to get walked away. Having a flexible pool of funding to fix the things to let them take advantage. The tree planting work. Maybe they want to do bus shelters, right? Another kind of canopy. If you could pool that money, or maybe community, they already have community gardeners. So maybe having, trees and urban agriculture. And then there's also water, right? And it will have a stormwater benefit. Maybe you want to have your water reconnected and lead service line replacement. So any ways that you can kind of have flexibility and let the community say, this is what you really prioritize and what we need, and have those co-benefits. And I think that the EPA community change grant and the other grants are like helping to move us towards the investments directly in those
I wanted to plug a comment that is in the Hoover app. One, I shared that resource that you've mentioned in the chat, so you'll have it there later. And then also we have a comment from Linda Durrill, who is kind of commenting, kind of asking how CBOs or grassroots folks can collaborate with these units of government that have decision-making power or funders to address these utility concerns. So high bills, increasing bills, shutoffs, what are the opportunities for community members to get involved there?
Go ahead, and
I can start
I have
with
a response. Got that working.
Okay. One of the resources for communities to get engaged is something called the Justice 40 Accelerator, which is not part of the Justice 40 initiative, but it provides technical assistance and grant startup funding for organizations to apply for the federal funding directly. And there have been cohort models of successful entries that they're getting. That's one resource, the Justice 40 Accelerator.
Selfishly, I actually kind of want to throw this question to our audience because I know that there are representatives from governments here. I'm curious, like in the cities that you or states that you represent, like what are you guys doing right now to work with your local community groups?
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. With the city of Indianapolis, we actually have a great local nonprofit partner called Citizens Action Coalition that does just that. They intervene in rate cases with our regulatory commission. They advocate for residents directly in all of those different scenarios. And so rate cases or recently we had an issue with just transitioning to a new billing software and residents were billed pretty just crazy amounts that were not accurate. And so CAC, this group stepped in to advocate and ensure that the utility is being held accountable. Just one example, I think, and that's an example of like where the city isn't even allowing that, right? Like there's community building happening and yeah.
Anything else?
Hello everyone, my name is Bamdele, Green Umbrella. Green Umbrella is a local non-profit organization in regional, local Cincinnati. So we cover 10 counties, the part of 4 in Indiana, 4 in Ohio, and 2 in Kentucky, northern Kentucky. So we have a program that is a climate safe neighborhood in collaboration with other non-profits, which is Groundwork Valley, to really go into the neighborhood who are underburdened and also low-income community. And it kind of being informed by mapping. So we have kind of our decision on that kind of effort, really go into those local community to develop some resilience planning with them, engage them in the climate action group, and also making sure that their information is kind of hard, coming in form of a resilience statement that will inform the policy and implementation of their neighborhood within that county. So that is kind of initiative we have at Green Umbrella, together with a nonprofit that engage and advocates practices neighborhood. So I have I think I raised 2 questions in the app. So, but maybe I can say Raji, maybe after that.
On the back.
Sorry. Come in, Sean.
Hi, everybody. I'm Shania. I'm with the City of Bloomington, Indiana. I'm the Assistant Director of Sustainability. In 2023, we joined Indiana University's Environmental Resilience Institute's Climate Resilience cohort. We worked on creating a climate resilience plan. We hosted 2 community engagement workshops. In the first workshop, we invited nonprofit organizations, city departments, county departments such as Monroe County Health Department and Emergency Management. At the first workshop, we prioritized climate risks and vulnerabilities. At the second workshop, we prioritized strategies to address those vulnerabilities. And this year, we are creating a Beat the Heat implementation team and also an urban gardening implementation team. And I'm really proud to say that we have been selected by NOAA and CAP Strategies to map our urban heat island. I have funding this year to distribute air conditioning units to low-income residents who have a medical condition that make them at higher risk for related illnesses. And so I'm partnering with our townships to distribute those air conditioning units. I also have funding to increase our tree canopy. And we have created a climate resilience map where we are using the tree canopy data. We have some outdated satellite heat data that we're going to be updating this summer. And we've also partnered with Bloomington Transit to figure out where our bus stops are located. And so wherever we have overlays of low-income residents that have low-income community sheltering those bus stops, and those bus stops are on that. Telling all of this data to have a really good indication of where we can prioritize our strategy. So a lot of exciting things happening in Bloomington.
Should make one more comment. It's actually in relation to what Morgan said.
to the person who put this question in the chat, Morgan talked about rate case utilities. One thing is, oftentimes, local governments can intervene on rate cases. They can proceed on regulatory proceedings. Historically, that's something that the city of St. Louis has not done a whole lot of in Jeff City, but in Kansas City, their Office of Environmental Quality does do some interventions in rate cases. I think that's a really good one to bring up because as St. Louis has a building performance standard and benchmarking law on the books, so they can make the arguments, obviously, for why this utility data is needed, so their building owners can buy. But also, cities act as representatives and have a lot of, they're huge utility customers. So there's power in flexing that ability to your legislatures, telling the PSC to like this should be a new regulation and authority that you guys should have on managing utility data, and it coincides too with the work that Rachel presented too. I mean, they can speak on behalf of their entire city. St. Louis is a population just under 300,000. You can aggregate how those utility customers are doing and make arguments on like why this data is needed, but also like we're telling you to pass these kind of laws because we need more intentional investment, especially on St. Louis. There's what's called the Delmar Divide. It cuts through the city north and south, and when you cross over to the north side over that divide, it changes, and it's typical in a lot of cities. On south of that divide is a neighborhood called Central West End, very affluent, mansions, all that, and cross over the divide, you see a lot of dilapidated housing and a lot of poor investment because of the history of redlining, like Sarah was saying. So like community-based organizations that are doing this consumer advocacy and utility advocacy and energy justice work, there's an opportunity to collaborate with your cities and get them to understand that you hold a lot of power as our city representatives. Here's how we can work with you guys on intervening at the regulatory level on rate cases, on integrated resource plans, and making sure utilities are doing the things that we need them to do with this data.
Great responses, and thank you so much for your participation. It's exciting to hear we have more. We are officially over. But thank you so much for all your engagement. There are some questions that we didn't get to in the app, so we'll do our best to go back through those and add resources and answers to be helpful. But if you have any other questions, feel free to come up and chat with us. And thank you so much for participating this morning.